Chapter 2. Anne awakened to a dull headache. She'd had difficulty falling asleep the night before as she worried about her encounter with the Viscount. What did the man want with her? She wondered for the 100th time. Determined not to waste another minute of worry, she shoved back the covers and swung her legs over the side of her bed as her maid drew the drapes. Accepting her morning cup of chocolate from her maid, Anne acknowledged that life in her aunt's household was decidedly better than on her father's estate in many ways. There were far fewer draughts here, for one thing, and for another, there were enough servants that one could actually be given the task of bringing her such a delicious, warm treat every morning. Anne allowed a contented sigh to escape her lips as she indulged in the decadent delight of being pampered. Then she gave her head a shake. She ought not to grow accustomed to such comforts. She was beginning to suspect that she would have to return to their run-down estate with her father when this season was over. If word got out about what she had almost done for her father and his friend, no one would want to take her as his wife. And even if word did not get out, she wasn't sure if she would be able to trust her own judgment, or trust that her father was not somehow being manipulated into manipulating her by one of his twisted and wicked friends. She thought back over the night before. The Viscount had good reason to be furious with her. She knew she was not the brightest young woman, but she should have realized there was something havey-cavey about her father encouraging her to set a cap for the Duke of Wrentham, and shuddered at the thought of what would have happened if that plan had not been averted. She did not expect a love match, but the thought of being married to someone who resented her for tricking him filled her with dread. Perhaps it would be better to remain unmarried, she thought with a lack of conviction. It would no doubt be better for her peace of mind, on the one hand, but knowing that her father was counting on her to pull them out of the suds did not bode well for any possible peace of mind. Perhaps she could discuss the entire quandary with her aunt. That cheering thought bolstered her lagging spirits, and she stepped down from the bed and allowed the attentive maid to fuss with her hair and get her gowned. Anne fingered the beautiful gown while the maid did the myriad buttons up the back. It had been years since she had worn such fine fabrics. While it wasn't until her mother died that her father had lost all control of their finances, even while she was still alive, they had not had an overabundance of spending money. Anne hated to think about it, but she suspected lack of funds might have contributed to her mother's quick decline into the grave. It was unlike her to be so melancholy. She tried to shake the negative thoughts. Anne knew her father counted on her to be steady, without highs and lows of emotion. It wasn't always easy. She had feelings just like everyone, but she did try to keep them under wraps to the best of her ability. It really helped if she didn't think too hard about any one thing. But ever since her father told her what had been behind his suggestion that she set her cap for the Duke, she had been having a difficult time restricting her thoughts. She had been filled with such anger, which was a foreign experience for her. But her father claimed to love her. How could he have thought it would be all right to arrange for her to marry someone, so his friend could control her new husband for some sort of nefarious purpose? It was not to be borne. Unfortunately, this line of thought was putting her out of sorts. Her father had not appreciated her thoughts on the matter when she told him how she felt. She rather suspected he was ashamed of the situation and didn't know how to face her. Anne hadn't seen her father for 2 days now. She hoped he had perhaps returned the evening before. That thought spurred her to hurry into the breakfast room, but it was empty save for the footman waiting patiently for the last of the family members to break their fast. "Good morning, my lady," the footman called out cheerfully. "Good morning, Jason," she replied, trying to infuse some warmth into her voice. It was not the servant's fault she was disappointed. Glancing at the clock on the mantel, Anne was surprised to see how much of the day had already passed. "Gracious, am I the last one up this morning?" "I do believe so, my lady." "I apologize if I have made you late for your other duties." "Pay it no mind, my lady." Anne was embarrassed to have kept the footman waiting, even though she was well aware it was part of his job. She had grown accustomed to looking after herself these past few years, and while it was pleasant to have servants to do things for her, she had a guilty feeling that it wasn't quite right to be waited on. She knew other members of the ton would decry her bourgeois sentiments, but Anne couldn't quite decide exactly how she felt on the subject. "Are you aware if my father has returned?" "I am not aware, my lady. Would you like me to go ask the butler for you?" Anne bit her lip, wondering what the proper course of action would be. Caving in to her intense desire to know her father's whereabouts, she accepted the servant's offer. "Thank you, Jason. I would appreciate that." The footman waited until she had filled her plate and was seated before he left the room. Anne managed not to fidget too much, and picked at the food on her plate while she awaited his return. Thankfully, she was not left waiting too long. "I'm sorry, my lady, your father hasn't been seen." The mouthful she had been chewing suddenly tasted like sand as her mouth went dry. She was really getting nervous about his absence and had no one with whom to talk the matter over. Anne had recently become aware that her father had unsavory associates. She made an effort to contain her anxiety, but her appetite was well and truly gone. With regret, she pushed aside her plate and got to her feet. "Have you seen my aunt this morning, Jason?" "Yes, my lady. I believe she is working on her correspondence in the morning room." "Thank you, Jason." Anne quickly left the room, fighting her guilt over the wasted food. Chastising herself for being a ninny, she reminded herself once more that while she was in her aunt's house, she was not the impoverished innocent she had been before arriving in London. Moving as quickly but as gracefully as she could manage, Anne arrived in her aunt's morning room only moments later. She paused at the door watching, as the older woman appeared deep in thought. Aunt Sophie was older than her mother would have been. All her children were already grown and married, which is why, Anne supposed, she had been willing to take her and her season on. She felt a warm fondness as she gazed at the older woman. "Good morning, my lady. Do you have a minute?" "For you, my darling girl, always. And please, you must call me Aunt Sophie." Lady Sophie bustled around, putting away her correspondence as she prattled on. "It is deplorable that we never knew each other better than we do. I really should have kept in better touch with my poor dear sister. You will never know how much I regret that, my dear. But I am hoping to make up for lost time. Come, have a seat. What did you want to talk about? Is it about that charming Viscount who is coming to take you for a ride this afternoon?" Anne stifled her groan. She had wanted to pour out her worries, but her aunt's prattle made her question whether she could bear to hear about her worries, and decided to keep her thoughts to herself for a while longer. "I really don't think Lord Dunbar has any sort of marital intentions toward me, my lady. I mean, Aunt Sophie. I do hope you don't get your hopes up too high." Lady Sophie laughed over her niece's words. "My dear, you sound like the old matron, and I sound like the debutante in this conversation. Why are you not more excited about the prospect of riding out with him this afternoon? Is there something wrong with the gentleman? He is very well reported on, I must tell you, and reputed to be remarkably wealthy. Would you like me to have your uncle look into him, if there is something in particular you are concerned about?" Her aunt's deluge of questions caused Anne to be even more reluctant to share her thoughts on the subject. No, nothing like that. I am sure he is perfectly lovely and above board. It is just that, when I was dancing with him, I did not at all get the impression that he has any serious thought of getting a wife for himself any time soon. I think he offered to take me for a drive, more out of a desire to turn you up sweet than to fix his interests with me." This observation caused Lady Sophie to let out a hoot of laughter. "Why would the poor boy want to turn me up, sweet?" "Perhaps he is after your husband for some political influence. Lord Dunbar's friend told me last night that he only attends balls for that very reason." "I can assure you, my dear, any gentleman who takes a look at you isn't thinking about advancing his political career." Anne knew her aunt meant it as a compliment, but she had a mirror in her room, and she was quite well aware that she was far from a diamond. And she barely had a dowry, so there was very little to recommend her as a potential bride. She stifled the sigh wanting to escape. Not wanting to concern her aunt, she turned the subject. "I actually wanted to ask you if you had any idea how we might find my father. I haven't heard from him in 2 days, and am beginning to get concerned." A change came over Lady Sophie's features at this. "I do not wish to speak ill of your father, my dear, but his absence would not do your prospects any harm. In fact, I am thinking that he probably finally took your uncle's suggestion that he clear out completely until we get you settled." Anne felt the blood draining from her face at her aunt's words. "But surely he wouldn't just leave without even saying good-bye," she cried. While she was angry with him over his manipulative ways, he was still the only family she had left. Her aunt was lovely, but Anne still felt as though she were practically a stranger. "I know my father has many faults, but he is still my father, and I am quite certain he would not just clear out without a word. Would it be possible for me to talk to my uncle about this? Might he have someone we could set upon looking for my father?" Lady Sophie sniffed disdainfully, but then relented. "You are no doubt right, my dear. We shall talk to your uncle about it, but I doubt he has any notion how to find him either." Anne stifled a sigh. She should have known better than to bring it up. It wasn't as though her aunt had made any effort to hide the disdain she felt for Lord Austen. There was little to wonder about that her mother had kept communication to a minimum with her family, if that was how they felt about her husband. Anne was well aware that her father had some glaring flaws, but he had been a loving father and husband while his wife had been alive. Forcing a smile to her face, Anne got to her feet. She tried to be nonchalant as she wandered about the room, trying to delicately take her leave of her aunt. She would have to work out her disturbed feelings on her own, she realized. "Thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I ought to go and write some letters of my own, and then, of course, I have to get ready for my drive. Perhaps I will take a little nap before the Viscount arrives, in order to ensure I have the energy for this evening as well." "That is a brilliant idea, my dear. It wouldn't do to be looking less than your best." Anne kept a smile on her face while she fought not to roll her eyes. She wished she could talk to one of her new friends. It was their influence that had brought about this urge to think for herself. She knew she ought to be upset about this change, as it was complicating her life. But she couldn't help but be proud of herself for trying to take control of herself. "Not that it will do much good," she grumbled as she entered her room. "What's that, my lady?" the maid questioned with a furrowed brow. Anne started and felt an embarrassed blush rising in her cheeks. "Oh, I was just talking to myself. Please, pay it no mind." The maid bobbed a curtsy and continued with her work, but Anne could feel her watching her out of the corner of her eye. There was something to be said for having barely any servants, she thought. At least one could manage a few moments alone. Regretting her uncharitable thoughts, Anne smiled at the maid, despite the fact that she was pretending not to watch her. Miraculously, the day passed quickly while Anne brooded over her options. Before she knew it, the moment she was dreading arrived. The footman knocked at her door and informed her the Viscount was waiting for her. Anne grabbed her gloves, glanced in the mirror to ensure all the buttons on her spencer were done up straight, and was gratified to see that her turmoil was not visible. Even her hair was behaving itself beautifully today. With a fanciful grimace at herself, she noted that if she believed in fate, she would be much more excited about this outing. As it was, she had to force her feet toward the stairs. Lady Sophie was enthusiastically entertaining Lord Dunbar as he waited for her. Anne paused at the door to observe his air of patient kindness, as her aunt regaled him with some piece of gossip that she had gleaned from her cronies the night before. "How very interesting," he murmured politely, before he caught sight of Anne hovering by the door. "Good day to you, Lady Anne. You look charming on this fine afternoon." He paused for a moment before continuing. "It is the strangest thing, my lady. It seems to be that you grow more lovely each time I see you." Anne couldn't help it. She rolled her eyes and laughed at his words. "Are you in your cups, my lord?" Her words surprised a chuckle out of the Viscount, but all he said in answer was, "Not at all, my dear. Shall we depart?" Hoping her hand wouldn't tremble and reveal her agitated feelings, Anne allowed the Viscount to pull it through his elbow as he escorted her to his waiting carriage. "There's no need for you to rush back, Anne, my dear. We are not promised anywhere overly early this evening." Anne was embarrassed at her aunt's words. There was no call to be so blatant, she thought with vehemence. It took her several moments before she could face the Viscount, while she battled her intense mortification. When she finally could look at him, she was relieved to see that he appeared not to have even noticed. No doubt it was a regular occurrence, she realized. This thought both cheered her and depressed her all at once. She resolved not to think about it. Realizing the silence was stretching a little thin, Anne strove for an innocuous topic to discuss. "It's a lovely day for a drive," she offered, happy to hear that her voice was steady, even if it was rather subdued. Wesley glanced at his companion. The mixture of feelings he experienced while in her presence was almost becoming familiar. He was angry and suspicious of her intentions, and yet he felt the need to protect her. From what, he would not be able to tell you. Her voice, although almost timid, was melodious and had a disconcerting effect upon him. He felt as though he could listen to her all day, even if it were just inane pleasantries about the weather. Determined to have a proper conversation with her, Wesley shoved the unwelcome thoughts aside for the moment and hoped he could get her to talk. "That it is, my lady. Thank you for accompanying me." He was surprised to see a twinkle in her eye as she asked him, in a prim voice, "What would you have done if I had refused? It isn't as though you even asked me. You asked my aunt instead. I was of a mind to tell her to accompany you herself." Wesley couldn't help laughing over her words. Well, that would have certainly taught me a lesson, wouldn't it? He was glad to see she was in on the joke and not taking offence over his laughter. "I apologize, my lady, if I was overbearing." "No need to apologize, my lord. I am quite well aware that is how things are done. It just doesn't strike me as being terribly polite. I am a person, too. It is disconcerting to be discussed as though I haven't a mind of my own." Feeling his eyebrows rising over her words, Wesley tried to keep his tone even as he replied, "Do you, my lady? You have given the impression of being an obedient girl who follows her father's wishes." He fought his fascination as her colour rose. She couldn't meet his eyes, but her chin rose in a display of defiance. "Recent events have helped me to see that a different approach might benefit me." "Really?" Wesley wished he did not have to concentrate on his horses as they passed through a busy section of road. He wanted to delve deeper into a statement and watch her face closely as they talked. He quickly resolved that they ought to walk as soon as they got to the park. Anne did not reply to his one-word question, and Wesley allowed the silence to return as he guided his well-matched bays through the entrance into the park. They were a little early for the truly fashionable hour, which was perfect for his plans to get her to talk. "How would you feel about taking a stroll first? We could drive around later when it gets a bit busier here." Anne cocked her head curiously. "Would it not make more sense to drive now and walk later? Isn't it irritating to try to drive around when the pathways get crowded?" Again, Wesley had to laugh over her words. "Well, yes, it is irritating, but it is what one does during the season. Do you not want to see and be seen?" He almost missed her muttered, "Not really," and wondered at her contradictory behaviour. She still hadn't answered his question, and Wesley's patience was wearing thin. He wanted answers from this young woman. He pulled his team over to the side of the road, and was glad when his tiger jumped down quickly to take their leads. He knew the high-strung horses would be in good hands with his young servant. Wesley felt Anne watching him intently. He reached up and lifted her down from the high carriage. "Come along, my lady. We shall be much more comfortable this way." Her dubious expression revealed that she doubted his statement, but she did not object as he set her on her feet. The Viscount was again unnerved by her petite presence. His continued anger with her vied with a desire to protect her, even if it was from himself. He hoped she was unaware of either of his sentiments. Her downcast eyes revealed nothing of her thoughts. They walked down a path that was less populated than the main thoroughfare. It was still perfectly respectable, but would allow them a level of privacy for the discussion he wished to have. He couldn't think of any delicate way to lead up to the main point, so he just plunged in. "Does your newfound desire for thoughts of your own have anything to do with your father's scheme to entrap the Duke of Wrentham?" Wesley could tell his question had caught her off guard by the way she stiffened slightly at his side, but anyone watching them would be hard-pressed to tell that anything was amiss. She barely revealed by the flicker of an eyelash that his question had discomfited her. "Why do you ask, my lord?" she countered. "Because I am furious with you for your efforts to entrap my friend, and I would like to know if there are any other schemes afoot." Wesley answered her honestly, but tried to control the fury that was creeping into his voice. He couldn't believe it when a tinkle of laughter escaped his companion. He didn't want to draw undue attention to them, but he couldn't help stopping dead in his tracks. "How can you find this amusing?" he demanded. "I apologize, my lord. You are quite correct. There is nothing amusing about this situation, aside from the fact that my aunt was quite convinced that you were displaying a marked interest in me, and was delighted at the prospect. I laughed when I thought about how sadly mistaken she was. I had tried to convince her that she could not be accurate in her assumptions, but she was steadfast in her thoughts. It is always gratifying to know that one was right, even if it is an uncomfortable topic." Wesley couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Your aunt thought I was trying to court you?" He was incredulous. Anne shrugged. "You did invite me to go for a drive in the park during the fashionable hour. It is a common practice when a gentleman is trying to fix a lady's interest, my lord." Wesley felt heat gathering in his cheeks. "You are right. I apologize, my lady. But why did you not follow along with your aunt's line of thought?" Anne pierced him with her perceptive gaze. "While you have been making every attempt to be civilized about it, my lord, it is obvious that you are angry with me. In fact, you have even told me so. It is not the usual frame of mind for a courting gentleman." He had to grin over her words. "I am sure you are correct, my lady." Now he was curious. "Have you had many men courting you this season?" Again the lady shrugged. "No." There was a pause while she avoided any eye contact. "My dowry is negligible. My father is a known spendthrift, and my family connections are not stellar. It was doubtful that I would make a brilliant match when we first arrived. Now, if my share in my father's scheme becomes known, no match will be likely." "You don't seem overly troubled by this." Wesley was perplexed over the lady's reaction, and he was beginning to find her repeated negligent shrugs to be irritating. He was surprised when she finally met his gaze with her own bright blue one. "I am personally rather confused with how I feel on the entire subject, my lord, and, unfortunately, I have no one to discuss the matter with." Wesley blanched over her words. He was so conflicted about this young woman. As a gentleman, he could not leave a lady in distress. It was just one more layer to the awkward situation. He surprised himself with his next words. "Since I am already involved in the situation, perhaps you could discuss it with me." He fully understood the shock reflected in her gaze. "But you are angry with me, my lord. I doubt you will be the most objective listener on the subject." "Actually, if we talk about it, it might help me be less angry as I come to understand your perspective on the matter." There was a moment of taut silence while she appeared to mull the matter over. The Viscount was taken aback by the sensation of relief that swept through him when she nodded. Anne could hardly believe she was going to take the Viscount up on his unorthodox offer, but she had no one to turn to and was feeling desperate to talk to someone. She took a deep breath and plunged in. "I don't even know where to start, my lord. I was furious with my father when I found out what was behind his encouraging me to set my cap at the Duke. Whether you believe me or not, I had no intention of trying to help Sir Broderick. I find that odious man to be repulsive." "Why, Lady Anne, that is the most vehement statement I have ever heard you make." Anne was surprised by the Viscount's teasing tone. Bashful, she answered him. "Do you not agree with my sentiments, though, my lord? I do not understand how the man is accepted everywhere. He puts me in mind of something one might find under a rock." Wesley chuckled. "Very well, my lady. I find that I am becoming convinced that you are not complicit in Broderick's scheme. But then, why would you agree to your father's suggestion that you try to entrap the Duke into making you an offer?" Anne was swept with a wave of mortification. She suddenly realized how awkward this conversation was going to become. Grimly, she acknowledged that she strongly doubted the Viscount would divulge the details of their conversation. And, since he was not actually interested in her for matrimony, she had little to lose by telling him the truth, and it would be such a relief to discuss the matter with someone. She looked the Viscount in the eye, somewhat exasperated by the dense question. "Really, my lord, do you have to ask? Look at me. My chances of getting married this season are slim. I am not a great beauty. I have no wealth or family to recommend me. It seemed like an expedient way to make a brilliant match. I allowed myself to be swept up in the idea that being a duchess would be lovely." She paused her words for a moment as they continued walking slowly. Then she turned to Lord Dunbar. "To be honest, I didn't give it a whole lot of thought. I was in the habit of following the direction given to me without questioning it. I have not been in the habit of having independent thoughts. When my father suggested what he thought was a brilliant idea, I went along with it. It wasn't until Lady Elizabeth and Miss Smythe discussed it with me that I even considered an alternative. And then, when I finally found out what my father's intentions had been, I was finally motivated to try to think things through for myself." "Have you come to any conclusions?" the Viscount asked quietly. Anne could hear that her small laugh was tinged with bitterness. "Not really, regretfully." She sighed before continuing. "If I had any means of achieving it, I would wish to establish my own home and never need to be dependent on a man ever again. But my father is depending on me to marry someone with the financial ability to save us from penury. I am beginning to feel that the idea is repugnant. But it is a common enough motivation behind many of the marriages of the ton, the Viscount pointed out reasonably. Perhaps so, but who is going to want me? As I stated before, there is very little to recommend a match with me. Anne wasn't fishing for compliments. She genuinely felt hopeless on the subject.